Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Process Experts again for another week. I am Dan Stoll, and today we have Steve Witt and Ray Cabral here to talk about technology adoption within the government sector, particularly here in the US, but tends to apply, globally. Essentially, I think most governments, organizations across the globe tend to have very similar issues as to what you have here in the US. Now, Steve, you've been working in this area for quite some time. What are some of the things that you see on a day-to-day basis when dealing with government organizations where you believe hinder them in implementing new technology?
Oh, yeah, great question. Thanks, Dan. And thanks for having us on. I think there's always the challenge of, the process to bring in a new technology is governed by a lot of things. They're governed by a lot of processes through the evaluation of the technology, through the selection of a vendor, ultimately through the procurement. So that alone can be it could be a long process in terms of time, right? It can be, we see procurement cycles that take 18 months, 24 months, maybe even longer, depending on what agency you're working with and what their process is like. So, when you're looking at doing things nowadays that need to be very, very quick and solve problems, like particularly like what happened during the pandemic, which was, hey, we're solving for problems that are like brand new problems. Like how do we do vaccine tracking? How do we do all these, PPP tracking? All that stuff is those didn't exist before, and now all of a sudden we have to solve for them. So those old processes really didn't work, right? So they were able to kind of be like, okay, here's how we get around them, or here's how we accelerate through them. And I think that opened up everybody's eyes to the fact that, hey, government can become more agile if we look at kind of streamlining these processes and look at what we're trying to solve for, right? Because I think when you look at like why do that, like the risk, right? The risk to the organization, but more importantly, the risk to the citizens, right? If you're a city county government, was if we don't do anything, there's more risk than if we do something that is around or through a process quicker. Right. And I think that's where people had it when it kind of forced their hand, because in other cases, pre-pandemic, it's like, okay, this is the process. We have to do the process. And there's nothing really kind of pushing it. There's nobody really pushing it through. And all of a sudden you had this compelling event, which is like, a global pandemic where things just needed to change rapidly. We were able to see organizations get through that process and then get rolling much quicker than they could before.
Yeah, and I would add on top of that, just adding in new staff. There's a big retirement happening in public sector and new resources coming in. Those new resources being younger, my generation, millennials, Gen Z, they're less prone to adopt the old legacy process, working in paper form. So that is also an obstacle, is just getting them to do the legacy process. They don't want to work in paper anymore. They want to be digital. They want to be mobile. So that's another issue that is bringing on technologies a lot faster.
Right. And do you find that it's any one particular department within these organizations that tends to be the stalwart of the old? So, is it IT holding up these procurement processes, or is it the budgeting or HR organizations holding up these processes, or is it a bit of everything somewhere along the lines?
I think it's a bit of everything, and it certainly varies by the type of organization and the organization itself. I tend to find that it's a cultural thing, right? Like cultures that, like, an organization where you have a culture of like, hey, we're going to get things done. We're going to get things done quickly. That kind of spreads across the board. Or if you have a culture of, hey, this is the way we do it, and we're going to do it, and we're going to do it this way, and it tends to be slower. Again, it tends to be across a culture thing, so it's kind of be across the board. But what we do see, particularly with, speaking of Nintex and like how we work with, kind of outside of IT in a lot of these cases, where you might have a digital innovator, a champion in HR, and they're pressing it forward, and maybe IT or procurement is like trying to pull the brakes a little bit. So you do see that sometimes we have like this conflicting personality thing in between departments. But I don't think it's unique to one department. Again, it's depending on the organization. But I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. And I guess, so looking at some of those issues, right, what are some of the steps, I guess, you can do, like, I guess from from Ray's point, where you've got this whole new generation of staff coming through the organizations who are wanting to do things more efficiently, they want to do things on their tablets and devices. How can vendors, such as ourselves or any other vendor for that matter, I guess embrace these changes to help those buying cycles and procurement cycles to get through and to get this new technology into government organizations faster?
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's that going back to culture, right? And we talk about this a lot at Nintex, the idea of a process culture, right? Like having people that are process minded in all departments, right? HR or finance or operations or what, and IT, people with a kind of approaching things from a process perspective. When you can understand your processes, you can understand where the challenges are, and then you can streamline them, right? I think that's when you get the visibility to the process, then you can identify the problems, right? And I think that's something that is pretty important. When I talk with customers all the time about like how are we going to deal with the organizational change of like innovation, and it's process, right? How do we onboard new technology quickly? Right? How do we do that? It's got to be different than the way it was done in the past, right? Because at the core of all of this, a lot of the processes put in place are to manage and mitigate risk, right?
Right.
Are we buying software we're not using? Are we misusing funds? Are we doing all these things? So you still want to keep that in mind, but you can certainly make that more efficient, particularly in this day and age with all the technology available, right? So I think when we look at organizations, they start to look at things from a process perspective. It elevates the visibility of those processes, which makes it easier to then, hey, we're going to improve this process, and then we're going to communicate it out to the internal staff that use it.
Right. Now, Steve, you've worked across, I guess, the government sector for quite some time, and you've also worked in the non-government sector. When you're going about, and I guess just to everyone, just to point out that Steve's in sales. He works as an Nintex sales guy, mainly in the government sector now. But in the past, you've sold to non-government. How do you approach and talk to these organizations differently? Is it pretty much the same, or is it, like you say, trying to find some of those champions like you would do in a normal setting, right? You would find someone to help you internally evangelize the product, to help internally sell, etc. Within a government organization, is it the same thing, but do you also have to layer on other aspects that you have to take into consideration, such as process change and cultural change that may slow things down, so you need to assist in those endeavors, like as part of that sales cycle?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly differences when you're talking to a commercial entity versus a government or public sector entity. And knowing the processes kind of they exist holistically, we can kind of have those conversations, and we can help shepherd the champion on the other end through the process, because we deal with it every day, right? Here at Nintex with our government team, we're working with hundreds of government agencies, all of which at a certain level have the same process, right? We've got to get and be able to show value. We want them to be able to quickly go back internally and show a return on investment to, hey, if we're going to invest in automation, or we're going to invest in e-signatures, like we want to get them to success quickly so that they can show the organization this was a worthwhile investment. So understanding how that process works at a high level is something I try to instill in my team, which is like, here's how we navigate through the process, and we work arm in arm with partners, with the government personnel we work with, and go through that process, because they're investing a lot of time in doing a vendor selection, or ultimately if they select us as a vendor, that's not the end of our process, that's the beginning, right? Because now they have to be onboarded to Nintex. We have to work them through working with customer adoption and our customer success team, building things out if it's an automation solution. So that's a journey that we work with from the very, very first conversation that we have about, hey, I have this problem, right? One of the problems we still see today, it baffles me sometimes, is people have a lot of InfoPath forms and they want to get off of them. So when we have that conversation, that's the beginning. And then there's a process to get them through the whole idea of like, is it a right fit for our technology? How are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? What people need to be involved? How we become change agents internally? So that's the whole process. And we, work hand in hand with them through the whole process.
Yeah, and on top of that, so we get a lot of public sector prospects coming to us knowing their pain, but another big problem that's apparent in public sector is them not knowing what pain they have. A lot of pain isn't apparent until you see tools that alleviate that pain. And to what Steve spoke to earlier, when it comes to discovering process, um, a lot of these public sector organizations don't even know that they don't know their own process. We say, "What's your problem?" They're like, "We don't know." So there's tools that we have to help with that. ProMap, a mapping tool, just helps you understand what the process is, which also helps with that employee turnover. As new resources come on board, they need to know what's the legacy process. All these retirees with tribal knowledge are leaving, and there's no knowledge transfer mechanism. So we have something like ProMap to help alleviate that pain, which again, not a lot of prospects know they have. And then on the discovery side, just finding out what that process is. If it's not known, we got discovery tools to help with that as well.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's a great point, Ray. We see a lot of customers that when they come to us, they're like, "Hey, I've got this problem. I think Nintex can fix it," but they also kind of self-diagnose, right? They're like, "Hey, I need this." And when you start having the conversation, because we deal with process every day, we deal with our technology every day, we can get into it and be like, "Actually, I think based on what you're saying, you actually need this. Like this would be a better way of solving your problem because the customer only knows what they know when they come to us." And the example I use is early on in the pandemic, like back in the summer of 2020, we were talking to an Nintex customer. We were actually talking to a lot of customers at that time because we're like, how can we help? How can we help build new things? Like we were given our time, we were doing consulting and coaching and all that. And we were talking to a CIO and said, "Hey, when we went remote, because we had never done remote before, we got a lot of requests from employees to get multifunction devices for their home, right? Which would be a scanner, print, fax machine. So you imagine if you had to buy one of those for every employee that worked remotely, and this wasn't a very large city government, but still, it was not enough where those would be hundreds of devices that they would need to purchase. And the CIO is like, "Well, why do you need it?" And they're like, "Well, we need to print out our form and sign it and put it back in." So they're like, "Oh, well, what you need was, you need electronic signatures." So they went out and bought a lot of electronic signatures. Now we were talking to them after that, and they were still having challenges. And ultimately, what we found was, and the CIO said this to me, was we didn't need e-signatures. We needed workflow because what they really needed was people wanted to request time off. People wanted to request expenditures. They wanted all that. Not every one of those needed an electronic signature, but all they knew was people were having a problem signing paper, so they bought an e-signature product, and what they needed was something more, right? They needed something where it was, hey, and they already own Nintex. We're like, hey, we just need more workflows. We need to be able to track who approved what and when. So the idea of kind of when you get in and talking with the customer, understanding what the true problem is, then we can come up with a solution for them. So I always remember that story because it was like it went from here to here to here, and it took a couple of conversations and actually getting into it until they realized what they needed.
Yeah. And I think that rings true for a lot of organizations too, right? When you start off small and you win that little project and you build out that first automation thing, and then it's like, now we've got this other thing that we could do, and then there's that other thing, and then all of a sudden you've got 20, 30 workflows doing all sorts of stuff. Now, Ray, working probably more on the technical side and dealing with probably more the IT teams and security teams within government organizations. Over the last few years, have you noticed a shift in how they operate? And as to, Steve's point, gone essentially are the days where a project, an IP project, would start and it might take, as to Steve's point, 18, 24 months just to go through all the due diligence, the security checking, all the bits and pieces. If it was health, got to make sure it's all HIPAA compliant, all that kind of stuff, right? To the point where they need to fix solutions for their customers, which is the internal organization. And they need to roll it out super fast because now everyone's working at home. And to Steve's point, they need things to be signed and they didn't need to be signed. And are you seeing changes in how they operate internally to better serve the staff at these government organizations?
Oh, 100%. And I think the pandemic accelerated that. I think with the response required for the pandemic, there was an acceleration of the need for tooling inside of these departments. And IT just didn't have the bandwidth to solve every problem that came up for COVID. So taking down these problems with a tool that can be pushed to the line of business or the department level was key. And fortunately, our tools allow for that. There's really no coding language background required to administer our tooling. So from an IT perspective, yes, adopting those tools faster and even just going from on-prem tools to cloud tools. I think that was a big shift that we saw from 2020 to about now, is just everything was on-prem prior to 2020. And now everyone's going to the cloud because it's just more agile. And on top of that, they're more modern. Administering them is a lot easier. You don't need to know SQL Server. You don't need to know how to do installs. It's just all ready and accessible right off the bat. And then bandwidth wise, again, pushing that down to the departmental level, all the process experts are there. You know, an IT person knows perhaps a coding language. They know SQL, they know SharePoint, but they don't know the process itself, and they don't know the bottlenecks and the problems. So getting that down to that level has definitely been something that we've seen more of. And I would even say purchasing going down to that level is something we see more of as well.
Right. Nick, did you see? Sorry, go.
No, I was going to say, just to add to that, you mentioned security. I think that's an important one, right? Because when you look at what FedRAMP was designed to do at the federal level, right, which is say, hey, this is going to be a common risk management framework that we're going to do, and then all these other agencies can leverage. So we don't have to constantly have these long security reviews. So getting FedRAMP is a long process, but once you're there, it makes it easier for agencies. The concept is it makes it easier for agencies to buy because the process has already been done in an agreed upon format, right? So you know we've got one product that's FedRAMP, another one on the way, and you know the plan would be to do all of ours in a FedRAMP environment with a FedRAMP authorization. That streamlines the process for security, right? And with that, also looking at the development of state ramp, right, where they're going to do the similar for state government, local government, having this common framework where it's not on the agency, right, the customer's individual security staff to do an analysis. They can trust in a process, and they can trust in the governing body, whether it be state ramp or FedRAMP, that they've done all the due diligence, that this has been a vetted solution. Now they don't need to worry about it. And that speeds up the process in theory from, hey, we want to buy this product. It's FedRAMP, so it doesn't have to go through the security process. We can go quicker that way.
Right. Now, you mentioned the state ramp. If you had FedRAMP, does that negate needing the state level as well, or not really?
State ramp's fairly new. The concept behind it is similar to FedRAMP, right? Because the federal packages that state agencies can't get, they don't have access to. So the idea is you get reciprocity, right? So as a vendor, like as Nintex, we could leverage our FedRAMP packages for draw loop and for DocGen, and then ultimately for NWCG, would then get reciprocity in the state ramp. So we would have to do some work, but we would technically not need to do an entire another round of audits and authorization, because state ramp is kind of pulling from FedRAMP, if you will. So there would be an efficiency there for sure.
Yep. Now, sort of talking still on the technology side, you mentioned a lot of organizations moving to the cloud to sort of ramp up and speed up a lot of those projects that they had to deliver. Did they have to make so obviously, Nintex wasn't the only platform they would go with. There's a whole raft of cloud solutions out there that they would have to have looked at to speed up a lot of delivery of services to customers. Did you see many? What's the right word? I can't think of the right word. But essentially, did they make any? Give me the word. I just cannot think of the word. Maybe there was a platform that didn't quite get all the tick boxes, but you know what? It was good enough for them to be able to roll out. Did you see much of that in this? I still can't think of the word that I'm trying to use, but essentially, because they needed to move fast, they had to make certain
like concessions, they had
to make certain concessions. Oh my goodness, they had to make certain concessions to be able to move fast, right? So Did you see that? Hey, we're going to run with this solution. It's not HIPAA compliant just yet, but we we can deal with it. Or hey, the data's being stored
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
different country. Um,
yeah.
we can live with it for now, and we'll revisit it later. Did you see much of that happening? Where, say, 4 years ago, that wouldn't have happened at all. They would have been, no, we're staying on prem because we can't use this solution because the data is stored in Canada, or it's not HIPAA compliant, or
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not accessible, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and that's been something that we've seen. Like, you can use those things as reasons to do something or not to do something.
Yeah.
And I was actually on a panel at a FedRAMP conference last week, and this gentleman Andre, who was on the panel with me from he was the CIO for the Department of Commerce. He had a great way of putting it. Right, he was like, the risk of not doing is greater than the risk of these other things, i.e. So, and you have to look at it, you have to balance the risk reward, right? But a lot of people will just be, okay, you're not FedRAMP, we can't do it. Or you're not this, you can't do it. Or you don't have this, you can't do it. And I think to your question is like the what I would say, the progressive leaders in doing this type of transformation in government, look for ways to do it and mitigate that risk, right? So you never want to be like, just do it across the board, but looking at it, it's like, hey, if we do nothing, that is more painful for our citizens, or more painful for our organization than, hey, we have a little bit of a risk or exposure here on maybe I don't want to say on the security side, but on the on the vendor side, or on whatever. So you kind of have to manage the risk of that, and do it in a way that keeps you agile. So that's kind of what I see progressive like CIOs like Andre doing, which is like, we have to solve this problem and we have to act quickly. And if we don't, that's a bigger risk than anything else.
Yeah, and I've seen it myself. Some concessions made, especially in Canada, on the accessibility requirements. I think some of these laws were made for older technology, like accessibility. I think applies more to Adobe, Word, but you want to adopt applications that have like responsive forms. They're not ready for those requirements yet. So I think there were a couple of cases where accessibility was required, but they just needed a solution and they needed to solve pain fast. So there was some concessions made there.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
And
there's a balance there you have to find between, like, okay, is it 100% or is it 90%, right? And then you're like, all right, well, the extra mile is going to cost this and it's going to delay this. So like, we can do this now with the understanding that like it'll be remedied later, that type of thing. Yep.
Right. And I guess that's kind of mindset too you see in the commercial world too, where it's right, hey, we're going to solve 98% of the problem with this. Hey, let's go. Whereas traditionally in the past, as to your point, Steve, some of those things could be used to just stall a project because, hey, we can't do digital signatures, so we're not going to do this other 90% of
Yep.
of the
Yep.
solution because of this one thing. Do you see that this is going to be essentially the mantra from now on across multiple government organizations, in terms of, hey, we need to solve real problems, and the risk of not solving the problem is greater than storing some data in a different state to us, or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I again, and like, security is one thing, right? But when you look at the nuances of like just being able to accomplish requirements, right? People sit and say, hey, we've got this long list of requirements, we want to do everything, right? And where I see, and this is not unique to government, but I think it's exaggerated in government, or it's a little bit more visible in government, is this, like, we take a long time doing analysis and not starting, or trying to make it perfect, right? Like, you've heard the thing, perfection is the enemy of good, right?
Yeah.
And that is, I think that kills these types of projects, right? It's like, let's get it good, and then we can work on making it better. But a lot of organizations, because of that I would say older legacy mindset of when you were doing custom app dev, it is, hey, we've got to get everything right up front. Otherwise, it's going to be downstream. It's going to make it worse, right? So you take all this time doing analysis and you get the requirements picture perfect, and then you go. Now we're in an age where, with low code, no code technologies like Nintex and things like that, we can move much faster. And speed is more important than getting it perfect, because you're never going to get it perfect. By the time you start, and you're like 6 weeks in, requirements are changing, right? The world's changing. So getting things done quicker is far more important than getting things perfect.
Yep. And on that, I think that's a great point to wrap it up. So thanks very much, guys, for joining me this morning or this afternoon, wherever you're listening in from. We'll have these videos up on our new landing page, hopefully within the next week or two. But as always, you can get these on LinkedIn. And until next time, see you later.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Steve.
Bye.